My parents abandoned me after graduation. Years later, I showed up at their reunion. My name is Isabella Hart, and I am 32 years old. This is the story of how my family left me behind, and how I found my way back to myself. The morning after my graduation, my parents dropped me off at a bus station with a duffel bag, $60, and the words, "Good luck out there, Isabella." My father said it, but the instruction came from my mother. I could see it in the way she refused to look at me, her eyes fixed on the road ahead as if she were already driving into her future, a future that had no room for me. There was no hug, no tears from them, just the quiet final click of the trunk closing and the sight of their taillights disappearing down the road. I stood there on the curb, still wearing the simple dress I had worn under my graduation gown. The fabric felt flimsy in the morning chill. I clutched the strap of my bag, the cheap canvas digging into my shoulder. The sound of distant applause from yesterday's ceremony still seemed to echo in my ears, a cruel reminder of an achievement that had apparently marked not a beginning, but an end. I thought it was temporary. A harsh lesson in independence, maybe. A test. I thought they would call in an hour, maybe two, and tell me where to meet them. They didn't. That was the day I learned love can be conditional. And for me, the conditions had expired. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. From the outside, the Harts looked picture perfect. Our house was a testament to my mother's relentless curation. It was a stately two-story colonial in a quiet Seattle suburb, the kind of place where the lawns were all the same shade of green, and the mailboxes were all tastefully uniform. In the spring, my mother planted tulips in perfect color-coordinated rows. In the winter, the wreaths on our door were always the most elegant. We were a living, breathing magazine spread, and my mother, Eleanor, was the editor-in-chief. Image was not just everything, it was the only thing. My sister Violet was her masterpiece. 2 years older, she was the daughter my mother had designed in her mind. She had our mother's sharp cheekbones and an effortless grace that made everything she did look easy. She got perfect grades, played the piano with a technical precision that passed for passion, and was a master of the polite, charming conversation that was our family's currency. Violet was a mirror in which my parents could see their own success reflected back at them. She was an asset, a blue-chip stock in the portfolio of the Hart family. I, on the other hand, was a liability. I was quieter, more observant. I preferred drawing in my sketchbook to making small talk at my parents' dinner parties. My grades were good, but they were never as good as Violet's. Where she was polished, I was a work in progress, and my mother had no patience for drafts. The favoritism wasn't overt. It was more insidious than that. It was in the air we breathed, in the foundation of the house. It was 1,000 tiny cuts, administered daily. I remember one Christmas when I was 12. I had spent weeks working on a drawing for my parents, a detailed charcoal portrait of our family home. I had poured my heart into it, carefully shading every brick, every leaf on the oak tree out front. I was so proud of it. On Christmas morning, after the chaos of presents, I gave it to them. My mother unwrapped it, her smile tight. "Oh, that's very nice, Isabella," she said, her eyes already scanning the room for the next thing. She set it aside on a table where it was quickly buried under discarded wrapping paper. A few minutes later, Violet sat at the piano and played a clumsy, stumbling rendition of Jingle Bells. When she finished, my parents erupted in applause. My father filmed the whole thing on his camcorder, beaming. "A true prodigy," he declared. Later that day, I found my drawing in the recycling bin. When I asked my mother about it, she waved a dismissive hand. "It was lovely, dear, but it's charcoal. It would have smudged everywhere." My father, Richard, was a ghost in our house. He was a man defined by his silences. I believe there was kindness in him, but it was a watered-down, passive kindness, no match for my mother's steely will. He outsourced all parental decisions to her, becoming her silent echo. He would watch her for cues, his opinions shifting to match hers. I once went to him, crying, after my mother had called my artistic ambitions impractical. I asked him, "Dad, do you think I'm a good artist?" He just patted my shoulder awkwardly, avoiding my gaze. "Your mother just wants you to have a secure future," he said, which wasn't an answer at all. It was a surrender. His refusal to stand up for me was a message in itself. You are not worth the conflict. Our family dinners were a masterclass in performance. My mother would steer the conversation, asking Violet about her debate club victories or her volunteer work. They would discuss Violet's future, which prestigious law school she would attend, which successful man she would eventually marry. When I tried to talk about a book I was reading or a project I was excited about, my mother's eyes would glaze over. "That's nice, dear," she'd say, before seamlessly turning back to Violet. "Now, Violet, tell your father about the fundraiser." I learned to be quiet. I learned to make myself small. I learned that my thoughts and feelings were an unwelcome interruption to the main feature, the wonderful life of Violet Hart. The summer Violet turned 16, a brand new convertible appeared in the driveway, a giant red bow on the hood. For my 16th birthday, my mother handed me a bus schedule and a monthly pass. "It's time you learned some self-sufficiency," she explained. "It builds character." That phrase, "it builds character," became their justification for every disparity in our upbringing. Violet needed tutors and private lessons to nurture her gifts. I needed to figure things out on my own to build character. Violet needed a generous allowance to learn how to manage money. I needed a part-time job to learn the value of $1. They weren't raising two daughters. They were curating one and tolerating the other. The college application process was the final act. Violet, of course, was accepted into an Ivy League school on the East Coast. My parents threw a lavish party to celebrate. There were balloons, catered food, and dozens of their friends patting them on the back for a job well done. When I was accepted to the state university a few hours away, the news was met with a quiet, palpable sense of relief. We didn't have a party. We had a meeting. My father spread financial aid documents across the kitchen table, the same table where we had so many silent, tense dinners. My mother tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the tuition figures. "Well," she sighed, the sound heavy with martyrdom, "at least you'll be affordable." The words didn't feel malicious. They felt worse. They felt like an honest assessment of my worth. I wasn't an investment like Violet. I was a cost, a line item on their budget that needed to be managed. Throughout my 4 years of college, they never came to visit, not once. But they flew to the East Coast several times a semester to see Violet, sending me postcards from their trips. They were teaching me independence, they said. But it wasn't independence I was learning. It was abandonment, delivered in slow, painful installments. They were slowly, methodically erasing me from the family portrait, preparing for the day when they could finally cut me out of the frame completely. Graduation, it turned out, was just the final snip of the scissors. The bus station was a universe of cold, hard surfaces. The benches were molded plastic, designed for temporary use, not for someone whose entire life had just been placed on an indefinite hold. The floor was speckled linoleum, scuffed with the journeys of 1,000 strangers. The air itself felt cold, thin, and stale, a mixture of industrial cleaning fluid and diesel fumes that clung to the back of my throat. I sat on one of those unforgiving benches, my duffel bag a pathetic little anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The $60 my father had given me felt like a joke, a final transactional insult. For the first hour, my mind was mercifully blank. I was in shock, cocooned in a thick, silent disbelief. My body was there, on that bench, but my mind was still in my parents' car, replaying the last 10 minutes. The forced small talk about the weather, the way my mother stared straight ahead, her knuckles white on her purse strap, my father's hand briefly touching my shoulder before he shut the trunk, a touch so light it was like being brushed by a ghost. I was trying to find a clue, a sign that this was all a terrible mistake. Surely a family doesn't just end. Not like this. Not on a Tuesday morning at a bus station. Every hiss of a bus's air brakes sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. My head would snap up, my eyes desperately scanning the parking lot, searching for their familiar gray sedan. I composed the scene in my head over and over. The car would pull up, my mother would get out, her face etched with regret. "We're so sorry," she would say. It was a test, a horrible, cruel test, but we're here now. Let's go home. The fantasy was so vivid I could almost feel the phantom relief wash over me. But with each arriving bus that wasn't them, with each passing minute that the parking lot remained empty of their car, the fantasy frayed a little more, until it was nothing but thin, transparent threads. As morning bled into afternoon, the shock began to recede, and the pain rushed in to fill the void. It was a physical thing, a deep, hollow ache in the center of my chest. The tears I had been unconsciously holding back began to fall. They were silent, hot tears of a grief so profound I didn't have the energy to make a sound. They streamed down my cheeks, dripping from my chin onto the front of my graduation dress. I cried for the little girl who had left her drawing in the recycling bin. I cried for the teenager who had ridden the bus while her sister drove a convertible. And I cried for the young woman on the bench who was realizing that the love she had spent her entire life trying to earn had never actually been real. I became part of the station's bleak scenery. People glanced at me, a girl in a nice dress, crying silently, and then quickly looked away, their faces averted as if my sorrow were contagious. A janitor swept around my feet, his expression carefully neutral. No one spoke to me. I was utterly alone, an island of misery in a river of people all going somewhere else. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the grimy floor, the station's atmosphere shifted. The commuters and families were replaced by the night dwellers, people with nowhere else to be, their faces etched with a weariness that I was beginning to understand. I watched a woman meticulously arrange her meager belongings on the bench across from me, creating a small, temporary home. The sight filled me with a terror so cold it stopped my tears. Was this my future? Would I become one of the ghosts who haunted these transient spaces? Exhaustion began to set in, a bone-deep weariness that was more than just lack of sleep. It was the weight of my entire life crashing down on me. I huddled on the bench, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to conserve warmth. I thought about my dorm room now occupied by someone else. I thought about my childhood bedroom, which my mother had probably already converted into a home office or a craft room. There was no home to go back to. There was no one to call. Sometime deep in the night, under the relentless buzzing hum of the fluorescent lights, something inside me broke. But it wasn't a final shattering break. It was more like a fever breaking. The overwhelming grief and self-pity burned away, leaving behind a hard, cold, and surprisingly clear residue. Anger. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was a quiet, icy fury. I was angry at their cruelty, at the calculated, casual way they had disposed of me. I was angry at my father's weakness and my mother's cold heart. But most of all, I was angry at myself for spending 18 years believing that if I just tried a little harder, if I was a little better, they would finally love me. I stood up, my legs stiff and sore. I walked to the large, dirty window that looked out onto the empty bus lanes. In the dark glass, I could see a faint, ghostly reflection of myself. I saw a girl with tear-swollen eyes and tangled hair, her dress wrinkled and stained. She looked broken. She looked like a victim. I stared at her, at this pathetic image of myself, and the anger inside me solidified into resolve. I would not be her. I made a promise, not to God or the universe, but to that broken girl in the reflection. I whispered it aloud, my voice hoarse but steady in the quiet station. I will not let you be the end of my story. I walked back to the bench and took my diploma out of my duffel bag. The cardboard tube was cool and solid in my hands. It was more than a piece of paper. It was proof of my own work, my own effort. It was the one thing they couldn't take from me because they had never truly given it to me. I had earned it. I laid my head down on the bench, using the diploma as a pillow. It was hard and uncomfortable, but it felt like a foundation, a starting point. The tears were gone. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in charge. The promise was. I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to plan. The night was almost over. Tomorrow, I would have to survive. The dawn that broke over the city brought no comfort, only a harsh gray light that made the bus station look even more grim. My promise from the night before felt fragile in the morning chill. It's one thing to feel resolve in the dark. It's another to act on it when you have $60, a duffel bag, and no plan. My first priority was to get out of the station. I felt like if I stayed another hour, I would become permanently fused to that plastic bench. I used the grimy bathroom to splash cold water on my face and attempt to smooth my hair. Looking in the mirror, I saw a stranger with my eyes, hollowed out and haunted. With my bag on my shoulder, I walked out into the city. The noise was a shock after the relative quiet of the station. Cars, buses, people talking. It was a world moving on, completely indifferent to the fact that mine had just collapsed. I spent $10 on a coffee and a bagel at a small cafe, eating slowly to make it last. The warmth of the coffee cup in my hands was the first real comfort I'd felt in 24 hours. I sat there for an hour, nursing that coffee, using one of the cafe's free newspapers to scan the classified ads. The Help Wanted section was a landscape of jobs that required experience I didn't have or paid wages that wouldn't cover a week's rent. The $60 was a ticking clock. I found a motel on the edge of town, the kind with a flickering neon sign and a sign in the window advertising weekly rates. The room cost $50 for the week. I handed over most of my money to a tired-looking man behind a plexiglass barrier. The room he gave me a key to was small and smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. The bedspread was a faded, ugly floral. The carpet was stained, and a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. But it had a door that locked. For the first time, I felt a sliver of safety. I collapsed on the bed and slept for 12 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure emotional and physical exhaustion. Waking up was a disorienting horror. For a split second, I didn't know where I was. Then the memory of the past 2 days crashed down on me, and the reality of my situation was suffocating. I had $10 left. I had a week until rent was due again. The fear was a living thing, a cold, predatory animal pacing in my gut. That fear became my fuel. I spent the next 2 days walking. I walked until my feet were blistered and my legs ached. I went into every restaurant, every coffee shop, every retail store, asking if they were hiring. The rejections were relentless and humiliating. They were polite. "We're not hiring right now, but you can fill out an application." And they were blunt. "You don't have any real experience." My one nice dress was now hopelessly wrinkled. I looked like what I was, lost and desperate. Finally, on the third day, I stumbled into a small, family-owned bakery. It was early, just after sunrise, and the smell of yeast and sugar was intoxicating. An older woman with kind, flour-dusted hands, who I would come to know as Mrs. Gable, was behind the counter. I asked the same question I had asked 24 times before, my voice flat with expected rejection. "Are you hiring?" She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my worn-out dress and the exhaustion in my eyes. I braced myself for the inevitable, "No." "Can you work early?" she asked instead. "I mean, really early." 5 a.m. "I can work any time," I said, my voice cracking with a hope I was terrified to feel. "Show up tomorrow at 5, she said. "We'll see how you do." I almost cried with relief right there in front of the pastry case. That same afternoon, my luck continued. I saw a Help Wanted sign at a 24-hour gas station a few miles from my motel. It was for the night shift, midnight to 8 a.m. The man who interviewed me barely looked at me. He just needed a warm body to watch the register. I told him I could start that night. My life settled into a brutal, monotonous rhythm. I would leave the gas station in the morning, the sun just rising, and walk to the bakery to start my other shift. I'd finish there in the early afternoon, my body humming with exhaustion, and walk back to my motel to try and sleep for a few hours before heading back to the gas station. Sleep was a battle against the daylight and the noise of the motel. Food was whatever was cheap, instant noodles, day-old bread from the bakery. My world shrank to the triangle between those 3 points. Bakery, gas station, motel room. I spoke to customers, but I didn't have conversations. I was a ghost, a machine that poured coffee and counted change. After a month, I had saved enough to move out of the motel and into a real apartment. Real was a generous term. It was a tiny studio on the top floor of a creaking, rundown building. The single window looked out onto the brick wall of the building next door, so close I could almost touch it. The place was barely bigger than my motel room, but it had a small kitchen with a working stove and a door that was all mine. The night I moved in, with nothing but a second-hand mattress on the floor and a box of my few belongings, I cried. But these were different tears. They weren't tears of grief, but of a fierce, desperate pride. This was mine. I had done this. The loneliness was the hardest part. It was a constant companion, a physical weight. Some nights, after a grueling double shift, I would come home to the silence of my empty room and feel an ache so profound it felt like a part of me was missing. In those moments, the temptation to call them, to beg, was immense. But I would always stop myself. I would walk to the small, cracked mirror in my bathroom and look at my reflection. I looked tired. I looked older than my years. But I also looked strong. The fear was still in my eyes, but it was joined by something else now. Resilience. "Keep going," I would whisper to the girl in the mirror. It was a prayer, a command, and a promise, all in one. It was the first time in my life that the most important voice I was listening to was my own. I was learning to be my own parent, my own provider, my own source of encouragement. I was learning to breathe on my own. And with every breath, the air was becoming a little less cold, a little less lonely. The bakery became my sanctuary. While the gas station was a place of harsh lights and transient loneliness, the bakery was warm and smelled of life. Mrs. Gable was a quiet, steady presence. She didn't pry or ask about my past. She just seemed to understand that I was someone who needed a safe harbor. She taught me how to knead dough until it was smooth and elastic, how to tell when a loaf of sourdough was perfectly proofed just by the feel of it. The work was physical and repetitive, and I found a strange comfort in it. The rhythmic motion of kneading dough felt like I was working out the knots of anger and grief inside me. My hands, which had once felt useless, were now capable of creating something warm and nourishing. But there was a part of me that the bakery couldn't feed. The creative spark, the part of me that loved to draw, had been dormant for months, buried under the weight of survival. One slow afternoon, I found a notepad and a pen left behind by a customer. On a whim, I started sketching. I drew the worn-out handle of the coffee pot, the way the light fell across a tray of cooling croissants, the tired but kind lines on Mrs. Gable's face as she concentrated on decorating a cake. It felt like coming home. The simple act of observing the world and translating it onto paper was a relief. A quiet place my mind could go where the worries about rent and exhaustion couldn't follow. I started bringing a small sketchbook to work. During my breaks or when the shop was empty, I would draw. Mrs. Gable noticed, but she never said anything, just smiled softly. One day, I decided the handwritten daily specials sign, a smudged and boring piece of cardboard, needed an upgrade. Using some colored pens I bought at a drugstore, I created a new one. I drew a cheerful, steaming coffee cup with a little smile, and used fun, bubbly letters for the words. It was simple, a little silly, but it was bright and full of personality. I taped it to the counter, feeling a nervous flutter in my stomach. It was the first piece of myself I had dared to show the world since my life had fallen apart. Mrs. Gable saw it when she came out from the back. She stopped and stared at it for a long moment. I held my breath, expecting her to tell me it was unprofessional. Instead, she touched the drawing of the little coffee cup gently. "Isabella," she said, her voice soft. "This is lovely. It makes the whole place feel happier." Encouraged, I made more. I created little illustrated signs for everything. The different types of bread, the flavors of muffins, a whimsical poster reminding people to have a nice day. Soon, the space behind the counter was a patchwork of my colorful, hand-drawn creations. Customers started commenting on them. "Your signs are so cute," a woman told me one morning. "They always make me smile." Each compliment was a tiny, precious drop of water on a parched and barren land. I was starting to feel like a person again, not just a survivor. There was one customer who was different from the rest. He came in every weekday morning at exactly 7:15. He was tall and had a quiet, thoughtful way about him. He always ordered the same thing, a large black coffee and a plain bagel, toasted, and he always paid with exact change. He never made small talk, just a polite nod and a quiet, "Thank you." But I noticed that he would always linger for a moment, his eyes scanning my drawings on the wall. I found myself looking forward to his brief, silent visits. In a life that felt chaotic and unpredictable, his routine was a small, stable point. One rainy Tuesday morning, after he had placed his usual order, he didn't move away from the counter. He pointed to a new sign I had made for our autumn-themed pumpkin spice muffins. I had drawn a little pumpkin character holding a steaming mug. "You make these?" he asked. His voice was calm and deep, and it startled me. It was the first time he had ever said anything to me beyond his order. Yes. "I do," I stammered, feeling my cheeks grow warm. He nodded, studying the sign with a focused intensity. It was the kind of attention I had only ever dreamed of my parents giving my art. "The composition is very strong," he said, more to himself than to me. The way you balance the text and the illustration. It's very effective. You have a genuinely good eye for design. I was speechless. He wasn't just saying it was cute. He was using words like composition and design. He was seeing it not as a hobby, but as a craft. He was seeing the thought, the skill, the intention behind it. He was seeing me. Thank you, I finally managed to whisper. He smiled then, a real, warm smile that transformed his serious face. My name is Daniel, he said, extending his hand. I quickly wiped my floury hand on my apron before shaking his. His grip was firm and reassuring. Isabella, I replied. You should be doing this for a living, Isabella, he said, his expression serious again. Graphic design, branding. You have a spark. The word spark hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the thing my parents had never seen. The thing I was starting to believe had been extinguished forever. To hear a stranger see it in me in this little bakery while I was covered in flour and exhaustion, it was overwhelming. He must have seen the flood of emotions on my face because his expression softened. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek, professional-looking business card. I'm a creative director at a marketing firm downtown, he explained, laying the card on the counter. We have an internship program. It's a great way to learn and get a foot in the door. I stared at the card. Sterling Marketing. Daniel Chen, creative director. It felt like a message from another dimension, a life I was supposed to have had but had lost. Fear and hope waged a violent war in my chest. The fear screamed that I wasn't good enough, that I was an imposter, that I would fail. But the hope, a tiny, flickering ember that I thought had died out long ago, whispered, "What if you could?" I don't know if I'm qualified, I said, the words tasting like ash. It was what my parents would have said. Talent is the only qualification that matters, Daniel said gently, and you have it. Think about it. He paid for his coffee and bagel and left, the little bell on the door chiming behind him. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the business card as if it might burn me. That small piece of paper wasn't just an offer of an internship. It was an offer of a different future. It was a door that had just been unlocked. For the first time in a very long time, I realized I had a choice. I could stay here in this safe but small world I had built. Or I could be brave enough to turn the key and see what was on the other side. I held on to Daniel's business card for a week. It sat on the small, wobbly table next to my mattress, a silent challenge. Every morning I'd leave for the bakery before dawn, and every night I'd come home from the gas station after midnight, exhausted and smelling of gasoline and stale coffee. I'd look at the card and a knot of fear would tighten in my stomach. The world it represented, a world of creativity, ambition, and 9-to-5 schedules, felt like it belonged to a different person. An internship meant interviews, professional clothes, and being around people who hadn't spent the last year just trying to survive. What if I wasn't good enough? What if Daniel was just being polite? My parents' voices were a persistent whisper in my head, telling me I was average, affordable, not special like Violet. But then I'd remember the promise I made to myself at that bus station. I hadn't survived just to stay hidden. With trembling hands, I used the payphone on the corner to call the number on the card. I was patched through to Daniel's extension, and my heart hammered against my ribs. When he answered, his voice was just as calm and kind as I remembered. I told him who I was, the girl from the bakery. Isabella, he said, and I was shocked that he remembered my name. I was hoping you'd call. He set up an interview for the following week. I spent 40 of my precious dollars at a thrift store on a simple black skirt and a white blouse. It was the most professional outfit I could afford. I ironed it meticulously using a borrowed iron from my neighbor. The day of the interview, I was so nervous I could barely breathe. I walked into the lobby of Sterling Marketing, a sleek, modern space with glass walls and minimalist furniture, and felt like a complete imposter. But the interview wasn't what I expected. Daniel didn't ask me about my grades or my non-existent work experience in the field. He asked me to bring my sketchbook. He spent 20 minutes flipping through the pages, studying the little drawings I'd made to keep myself sane. He looked at my sketches of tired commuters, of the way the morning light hit the flour-dusted counters at the bakery, and the posters I had designed. "You see things?" he said, finally looking up. "You don't just draw what's there, you capture how it feels." That's a rare skill. He offered me the internship on the spot. It was unpaid, a fact that made my stomach sink. I couldn't afford to quit my other jobs. For the next 6 months, my life became an impossible balancing act. I worked at the bakery from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. Then I'd rush to the internship from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Then I'd work the gas station from 6 p.m. to midnight. I slept 3 or 4 hours a night. I lived on caffeine and sheer willpower. Some days, I was so tired I would fall asleep on the bus, waking up just before my stop in a panic. But for the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy. The internship was everything. I was a sponge, soaking up every piece of information. I learned about branding, color theory, and digital design software. I started as the girl who got coffee and made copies, but I watched everything. I stayed late, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I would study the projects the senior designers were working on, trying to understand their choices. My first real assignment was small: design a flyer for a local charity bake sale. It was a simple task, something most interns would do quickly. But to me, it was the most important project in the world. I spent hours on it, sketching dozens of ideas, agonizing over fonts and colors. I remembered the warmth of Mrs. Gable's bakery and tried to pour that feeling into the design. When I presented it to Daniel, he was quiet for a long moment. He just looked at the flyer, then back at me. "You're a natural at this, Isabella," he said. After the 6-month internship ended, they offered me a full-time, paid position as a junior designer. The day I received that offer letter was the day I quit my job at the gas station. A few months later, I left the bakery, giving Mrs. Gable a tearful hug and a professionally designed new menu as a thank you gift. The next few years were a whirlwind. My survival instinct, that relentless drive that had kept me going, was now channeled into my work. I was focused, hungry, and determined to prove myself. I worked my way up from junior designer to senior designer. Within 2 years, I was their lead designer, managing my own team. My work was on billboards, in magazines, and on websites for major clients. The shy, invisible girl was now in charge of how the world saw multi-million-dollar brands. I was 25 when I decided to leave. It was the scariest decision I'd ever made. Sterling Marketing was my home, my safety net. Daniel had become a mentor and a true friend. But I had a vision for a different kind of creative agency, one that was smaller, more personal, and focused on telling authentic stories for brands that were trying to do some good in the world. So I took the leap. I cashed out my small savings, rented a tiny office space, and started my own creative studio. I needed a name. For days, I agonized over it. I wanted something that was mine, something that represented my journey. And then it hit me. The name I had once wanted to escape, the name that was associated with so much pain and neglect, was the one I needed to reclaim. I would not let them have it. I would redefine it. I named my company Heartline Designs. Success didn't come overnight. The first year was a struggle. There were moments I was terrified I had made a huge mistake. But I remembered what it felt like to sleep on a bus station bench with $60 to my name. Compared to that, this was nothing. I worked relentlessly, and slowly I started to build a reputation. My work was good and my passion was evident. One client led to another. Success didn't heal me. The wounds from my childhood were still there. The memory of my parents driving away never completely faded. But success gave me something else. It gave me silence that didn't hurt. It gave me a home that felt safe. It gave me a life that I had built with my own 2 hands, a life that no one could take from me. It gave me proof that I was not the person my parents had decided I was. I was Isabella Hart, the founder of Heartline Designs, and I was just getting started. 13 years. 13 years of silence. That's how long it had been since the day they left me at the bus station. In those 13 years, a lot had changed. I was no longer the scared 18-year-old. I was 32. My tiny studio apartment had been replaced by a bright, airy condo overlooking Lake Washington. Heartline Designs had grown from a one-woman operation into a thriving business with a dozen employees and a waiting list of clients. I had built a life for myself, a good one, filled with work I loved, a few close friends, and a sense of quiet, stable peace. I had never reached out to my family. There were times, in the beginning, when the loneliness was so sharp I almost picked up the phone. But the memory of my mother's cold eyes and my father's weak silence always stopped me. What would I say? Why did you leave me? I knew I would never get an honest answer. They had made their choice, and I had been forced to make mine. I heard about them occasionally, through the grapevine of distant relatives I hadn't completely cut ties with. I knew Violet had married a wealthy man and was now a prominent figure in the local charity scene. I knew my father had retired. They still lived in the same house in the same town, living their same picture-perfect life. I was a ghost in their past, a secret they had successfully buried. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the invitation arrived. It came to my office delivered by a courier. It was in a thick, cream-colored envelope, my name and address written in elegant calligraphy. It felt heavy, important. I slid it open with a letter opener. My curiosity piqued. Inside was a card, embossed with a golden stylized letter H. It read, "The Hart Family Reunion, Celebrating Legacy and Love." I stared at the words, and a dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Legacy. Love. They were using words they didn't understand. A family reunion. After 13 years of treating me like I didn't exist, they were inviting me to a party. Tucked inside the card was a smaller, personal note, written on my mother's monogrammed stationery. Her handwriting was as perfect and controlled as ever. "Dearest Isabella," it began. The word dearest was like a slap. "It has been far too long. We hear you've been doing wonderfully for yourself, and we are all so incredibly proud of you. We would love for you to come to the family reunion. It's being held at the Willows estate on the Sound. It would mean the world to us to see you there, sweetheart. Everyone is so eager to reconnect. Love?" Mom, I read the note 3 times, each word a small, sharp sting. Proud? How could they be proud? They had no idea who I was. They hadn't been there for the nights I cried myself to sleep from exhaustion and hunger. They hadn't seen me pour my life savings into a business they would have called a foolish risk. They hadn't witnessed a single moment of the struggle or the triumph. They wanted to claim my success, to display me like a trophy they had inexplicably acquired. Sweetheart. The casual term of endearment felt like a lie, a costume she was putting on for this performance. They weren't proud of me. They were proud of my accomplishments, which they had read about in a local business journal that had featured my company. My success made them look good. My presence at their reunion would complete their perfect family picture, tying up the one loose end they had left dangling. My first instinct was to tear the invitation into 100 pieces and throw it in the trash. Why would I go? Why would I subject myself to their false smiles and empty words? I didn't need their approval. I hadn't needed it for 13 years. I spent the next few days in a fog. The invitation sat on my desk, a silent accusation. It stirred up feelings I thought I had long since buried. The old hurt, the feeling of being worthless, of being the unwanted child. It was all there, just beneath the surface, waiting. I talked to Daniel about it over coffee. He listened patiently as I vented, my voice tight with an anger I hadn't felt in years. "So don't go," he said simply when I was done. "You don't owe them anything, Izzy." "I know," I said, stirring my coffee, watching the spoon swirl in the dark liquid. "But a part of me wants them to see me. Not the version of me they read about in a magazine, but me. The person who stood on that curb and watched them drive away." Daniel nodded slowly. "So this isn't about them. It's about you." He was right. For days, I had been thinking about it from their perspective, what they wanted, what they were trying to do. But what did I want? Did I want revenge? Did I want to make them feel guilty? No, that wasn't it. Revenge felt loud and messy. Guilt was their burden to carry, not mine to inflict. Then I realized what I wanted. I wanted closure. For 13 years, the last image they had of me was a scared, abandoned girl. The last image I had of them was of their taillights disappearing. That single moment had defined our relationship, or the lack of it. It was an open wound. Going back wasn't about trying to repair things. It wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about closing the chapter on my own terms. It was about walking back into their world, not as the victim they had created, but as the woman I had become in spite of them. I wouldn't go seeking their love or their apology. I would go to show them and myself that I didn't need it anymore. I would go to replace that final, painful memory with a new one, a memory of my own strength. That evening, I went home and RSVP'd. One word written in my neatest hand on the small reply card. Attending, I sealed the envelope. I wasn't going to their reunion. I was going to my own. The day of the reunion, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The anxiety I expected to feel was absent, replaced by a quiet, detached resolve. I chose my outfit carefully. A simple, elegant navy blue dress, well made but not flashy. It was the kind of dress that spoke of quiet confidence, not a desperate need for attention. I wore my hair down, styled in a way that was professional yet soft. As I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a woman I respected. She was a survivor. She was ready. The Willows estate was even grander than I had imagined. It was a sprawling mansion overlooking Puget Sound, with manicured lawns that rolled down to the water's edge. A valet took my car, a modest but reliable sedan that I had bought with my own money. As I walked up the stone steps to the entrance, I could hear the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses. It sounded like any other upscale party. I paused at the doorway, taking a deep breath. The large terrace was filled with people I vaguely recognized. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them older now. They were dressed in their Sunday best, smiling, laughing, performing their roles in the grand play of the Hart family. And there, in the center of it all, were my parents and my sister. My mother was holding a glass of champagne, looking regal and perfectly in control. My father stood beside her, a fixed, pleasant smile on his face. And Violet? Violet was a perfect copy of my mother. She had the same polished look, the same practiced grace. They were the perfect family, the hosts of this perfect celebration of their perfect legacy. I stepped through the French doors onto the terrace. For a moment, no one noticed me. I was just another guest. Then my uncle, my father's brother, saw me. His eyes widened slightly, and the conversation he was having faltered. He nudged his wife. She turned and her smile froze. Like a ripple in a pond, the awareness of my presence spread across the terrace. The chatter dimmed. One by one, heads turned in my direction. Finally, my mother saw me. Her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. The color drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a mask. My father froze, his hand tightening on his own glass. Violet's flawless smile faltered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. The silence was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and full of 13 years of unspoken words. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. I was no longer the forgotten child. I was the unexpected guest, the ghost they thought they had buried, walking back into their lives wearing designer heels. My mother recovered first. She placed her glass on a nearby table and walked toward me, her movements a little too stiff, her smile a little too bright. "Isabella," she whispered, her voice a strained imitation of warmth. "You came." I offered a small, calm smile in return. It didn't quite reach my eyes. "You invited me." She reached out as if to hug me, but then hesitated, letting her hands fall back to her sides. The gesture was awkward, uncertain. She didn't know what to do with me. I was a problem she hadn't planned for. "You look wonderful," she said, her eyes scanning my dress, my hair, my face, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before her with the girl she had left behind. "So do you," I said politely. It was true. She looked exactly the same, just older. My father and Violet approached, moving like they were walking on eggshells. My father couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a point over my shoulder. "Good to see you, Isabella," he mumbled. Violet was less subtle. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Resentment, maybe? "We didn't actually think you'd come," she said, her voice sharp. "And miss a celebration of legacy and love?" "I wouldn't dream of it," I replied, my tone even. The reunion slowly resumed its rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed. I was the center of attention, the subject of whispered conversations and curious glances. Distant relatives came up to me one by one. Their greetings were a mixture of awkwardness and forced enthusiasm. "Isabella, look at you. All grown up. We read about your company. How marvelous. Your mother must be so proud." I nodded and smiled, offering polite, non-committal answers. I felt like an anthropologist observing a strange, foreign tribe. I saw them all so clearly now. The performance, the superficiality, the carefully constructed facade of a happy, loving family. I had been outside of it for so long that I could see the cracks they couldn't. I realized with a startling clarity that I hadn't missed this at all. I hadn't missed the pretense, the emotional emptiness, the constant, low-level anxiety of trying to win an approval that was never on offer. I stayed for an hour, sipping a glass of sparkling water, observing. I watched my mother work the room, her laughter a little too loud. I watched my father retreat into the background, nodding and smiling on cue. And I watched Violet, who kept shooting me looks from across the terrace, a mixture of anger and confusion in her eyes. I finally understood. They weren't a family. They were a brand, and I had been a product they had discontinued. Standing there, surrounded by the life that had been denied me, I felt not a single shred of regret. I felt only a profound, liberating sense of detachment. I didn't belong here anymore, and I was so incredibly grateful for that. Dinner was announced, and we were all ushered into a grand dining room. The table was a long, polished expanse of dark wood, set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses. It was beautiful, opulent, and incredibly cold. I was seated between a great-aunt I barely knew, and one of Violet's friends, a woman who looked me up and down with open curiosity. My parents sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal like a king and queen. The conversation was just as I expected. Polite, awkward, and brittle. They talked about things that mattered on the surface. My uncle bragged about his son getting into law school. My aunt recounted every detail of her recent trip to Italy. Violet held court, talking about the upcoming charity gala she was chairing. It was a competition of accomplishments, a carefully orchestrated performance of success. No one asked me any real questions about my life. They didn't ask what it was like to build a business from nothing. They didn't ask about my struggles or my passions. They simply made statements based on the public version of my story they had consumed. Running your own company must be so exciting, my great-aunt said. I just smiled and nodded. It keeps me busy. The meal wore on, course after course of meticulously prepared food I could barely taste. The tension was a living thing at the table, a silent guest that everyone was trying to ignore. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, trying to gauge my mood, trying to figure out what my game was. Finally, during a lull in the conversation after the main course was cleared, she raised her glass. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her voice ringing with false cheer. The room fell silent. She smiled, a wide, practiced smile that didn't touch her eyes. She looked directly at me. "To Isabella," she said. "It has been too long, but we are all so happy to have you back with us. You've done so well for yourself. We are so proud of the woman you've become." A murmur of agreement went around the table. People smiled at me, raising their glasses. This was the moment. This was the performance I had been invited to star in. The prodigal daughter returns, her success a testament to the family's excellent stock. They were absorbing my story into theirs, erasing the 13 years of abandonment and replacing it with a narrative of pride. I didn't raise my glass. I simply set my fork down gently on my plate, the small clink echoing in the quiet room. I met my mother's gaze across the long table. Her smile faltered slightly. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice quiet but clear. Every head turned toward me. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding." The air grew thick. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Violet stared at me, her jaw tight. I looked at my mother, holding her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "You didn't raise this woman," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "You left her at a bus stop." A collective gasp went through the room. Forks paused midair. My great-aunt's jaw dropped. The carefully constructed facade of the evening shattered into a million pieces. The silence was deafening. My mother's face went pale, then flushed with a deep, angry red. "Isabella, this is not the time or the place," she began, her voice shaking with fury. "I'm not trying to make a scene," I said, and it was the truth. My heart was beating steadily. There was no rage in my voice, only a calm, unshakable certainty. "I'm just stating a fact. The woman I am today was built in a rundown apartment, in a bakery at 5 a.m., and on the night shift of a gas station. She was built during the years you were silent. You don't get to be proud of her. You don't know her." I let my gaze travel from my mother to my father, who was staring down at his plate as if it held the answers to the universe. Then I looked at Violet, whose face was a mask of cold fury. "I'm not angry," I added, and the quiet truth of that statement seemed to shock them more than anything else. "I just wanted you to see what surviving looks like. This is it." With that, I placed my napkin on the table and pushed my chair back. I stood up, my movement slow and deliberate. "Thank you for the invitation," I said to the room at large. "Enjoy your reunion." "I've got a life to get back to." No one said a word. No one moved. They just stared, their faces a mixture of shock, horror, and disbelief. I had spoken the truth in a house built on lies, and they were utterly paralyzed by it. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my footsteps the only sound. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had said everything I needed to say. I had closed the chapter. As I walked out of the mansion and into the cool night air, it felt like I could finally breathe again. The valet brought my car around, his face impassive, as if he hadn't just witnessed the quiet implosion of a family. I tipped him and got into the driver's seat, the familiar feel of the steering wheel under my hands a comfort. As I drove away, the reflection of the brightly lit estate faded in my rearview mirror until it was just another light in the distance. The same road that once carried my parents away from me, leaving me in tears, now carried me toward a profound and settled peace. The knot of old pain that I had carried in my chest for so long, sometimes a dull ache and sometimes a sharp sting, was gone. It hadn't been burned away in anger, but had simply dissolved in the clear light of truth. That night, I unlocked the door to my own apartment. My home, my choice, my life. The air inside was still and quiet, filled with the things I had chosen and earned. I walked over to my desk and picked up a simple black frame I had bought a few days earlier. Inside it, I placed a photograph I had taken a year ago. I had driven out to that old bus station, half expecting it to be gone, but it was still there, older and more run down, but unmistakably the same. I had taken a picture of the empty bench, bathed in the soft light of early morning. It was the place where my life had broken apart. It was the place where I had been left. I hung the framed photo on the wall beside my college diploma. For 13 years, the memory of that bus stop had been a source of pain, a symbol of my abandonment. But now it was something else. It was proof. Proof that you can be left in the dark and still find your own way to the light. Proof that the places that break you can become the foundations of your strength. It was a reminder that my story didn't end there. It began there. If you've ever been left behind, if you've ever been made to feel like you weren't enough, don't waste your energy chasing those who abandoned you. Don't wait for an apology that will never come. Turn around and start walking in the other direction. Build something so real, so true, and so completely your own that they have to look up to see you. And if this story found you tonight, hit subscribe and keep walking toward your own reunion. The one that's waiting for you inside yourself, the one that doesn't need anyone else's approval.